Karl Marx was appalled at the horrible factory conditions. He blamed the system of industrial capitalism for these conditions. The solution was a new social system called Marxist, which eventually was changed to communism. Industrial capitalism is an economic system based on industrial production. Industrial capitalism produced a new middle-class group, the industrial middle class. James Watt was a Scottish engineer that in 1782 made changes for driving machinery. They started to use steam power to spin and weave cotton. Before long, cotton mills using steam engines were found all over Britain. Because his steam engines were fired by coal, they did not need to be located near rivers. A revisionist is someone who rejected the revolutionary approach and argued that workers must continue to organize in mass political parties and even work with other parties to gain reforms. The Industrial Revolution in Great Britain began in the 1780s. It took 7 decades to spread to other Western nations. Contributing factors were higher agricultural practices, an expansion of farmlands, good weather, and improved transportation. They also had new crops, and there were lower prices in labor. There were more food in supply, so the population grew. There was a large labor force and a ready supply of money to invest in industrial machines and factories. Entrepreneurs invested in finding new business opportunities to make a profit. During this time, natural resources were plentiful. Many rivers provided water power and transportation for materials and finished products. A large supply of coal and iron ore were ready for use. In Europe, the spread of industrialization began first in Belgium, then France, then the German states. The governments encouraged it. They provided funds. In 1850, iron rays spread across Europe. Soon the revolution spread to North America. In the 1800s, 6 out of 7 people worked on a farm. Between 1800 to the 1860s, the population went from 5 million to 30 million, 50% of those being farmers. During the 1700s in Europe, the population got higher. Clothes manufacturers were the first to be affected. The process was slow. Clothes were spun by hand from spinners that were located in people's houses. In 1733, the flying shuttle was invented. It was needle-like, with the intention to weave thread. In 1760, the spinning jenny was made by James Hargreaves. It was invented for homes but was too heavy, so they had to keep them in factories. In 1785, Edmund Cartwright designed a water-powered loom that could weave faster. The first successful steam engine was invented in 1712 by Thomas Newcomb. In the 1780s, only a few people used steam power. By 1850, 150 boiler explosions killed 14,000 people. In the 1700s, Great Britain wanted to build textile companies in the United States. They didn't like this, so they made a law saying the machines couldn't leave the country. Samuel Salter worked in a company, and he brought over spinners to America. In 1789, he acted like a farmer and went to America. In the late 1700s, Alexander Hamilton believed in industrialization. In 1791, he presented this idea to the people. There were no rights to own your own work. In 1790, the first patent law was made. Eli Whitney made the cotton gin. There were more fibers to make things. In 1840, plantations made 60% of the world's cotton. Factory conditions were very bad. In 1813, textile companies opened in Massachusetts with girls from the ages of 16 to 31 working there. It paid $2.40 to $3.40 per week, half of what men made. Girls were encouraged to take classes and attend lectures and borrow books. They had a 10 p.m. curfew and must have attended church. They were not able to pick their own hours, and factories had very unsafe disposal of waste. The clothing industry grew in the 1800s. They had trouble finding workers, so they sent advertisements over to Europe. In 1880, 1.6 million Irish, 1.3 million German, and 588,000 British workers came over to work for less money. In 1800, factory conditions were poor, and they worked long, hard hours. During 1860, a labor union broke out. In 1870, it attracted 600,000 members. In the 1800s, steamboats were made to transport goods over water. A 40-mile trip cost $1.25. Robert Fulton made the boat bigger to carry people and material. In 1807, he completed his steamboat. He cut the cost by 90%. In 1829, steamboats were used to travel from New York to London. Soon after they made steamboats, they made steam-powered trains. They were built during the 1850s and 1860s for $65 million. Coast-to-coast railroads were finished on May 10, 1869. Samuel Morse invented the telegraph in 1830s, making a system of opening and closing electrical connections to send a message. He got the patent for the telegraph. In 1843, the Morse Bill was passed. By 1861, they installed 76,000 miles of telegraph line. In the late 1800s, people wanted to transmit the human voice. In 1875, Bell started. 1 year later, he spoke on the telephone. In 1877, Bell started a telephone company. In 1884, he opened his first long-distance line. Telephones were installed in private homes in the 1800s to the 1900s. In 1876, men were encouraged to buy telephones if they could afford it. In 1878, Emma M. Nutt was the first female hired to work at the telephone company. In the 1890s, 19,000 telephone operators were employed. In the 1900s, nearly 1 million were hired. Edison made his first invention in his lab in 1876 in Menlo Park in New Jersey. In the late 1870s, he tried to prove the power of electricity. In 1880, he had a demonstration of lights with a flip switch. At 3:00 p.m. on September 4th, 1882, he held a lamp demonstration in New York City. Soon after, towns used electricity, then factories. Andrew Carnegie was an immigrant that made a profit from the steel boom. He bought the world's largest steel mill in 1875. In the 1900s, Andrew Carnegie produced 3 million tons of steel per year, worth $40 million. In 1867, the Rockefeller brothers made an oil pipeline. In the 1800s, big businesses were increasing. They controlled resources. On July 2, 1890, Congress passed the Sherman-Arthrust Act. On March 1, 1892, the Standard Oil was guilty of establishing a virtual monopoly. In 1911, after Roosevelt left office, Supreme Court was finally able to break up the monopoly. Newcomers in America had to live in tenant houses. There were many diseases, like measles and smallpox. They spread fast and lots of people couldn't work. The death rate was higher than ever. In the 1900s, children died in the first year of life. People outside of the cities didn't know about the problems until people started writing about it. Hamper's Weekly exposed the conditions, and Congress passed laws, but they weren't enforced. Whoever could afford it lived in cleaner boarding houses.